And good morning. Happy Friday. So, interesting, a new technical glitch has come up. It looks like streaming is working on Periscope and YouTube and Twitch, but now the tweet that goes out is different. So that's interesting. Oh, okay, there it goes. It just took a while to preview. Okay, so today I thought I would talk about a ancillary topic or related topic, and that is Power Automate. And you've probably heard of Power Automate. If you haven't, welcome. Here's a quick introduction. And well, let's just jump into it. So I have a script, a PowerShell script that runs on my main Docker development server. And every morning it checks to see if there's a new version of BcContainerHelper. It gets the current version that I have installed. It goes out to whatever magical cloud repository contains BcContainerHelper, checks the version that's available now, compares those versions, and if there's a new version, it uninstalls my old version, installs my new version, and sends me an email. So this tweet over here is an example of what that email looks like. It's just an automated email saying, hey, I've updated BcContainerHelper. So I thought, okay, well, it doesn't happen that often. So when it does happen, I want to know about it. So I tweeted that. I said, hey, here's my new script. I've added version information in this new version of my script so that it tells me, it tells me like what's going on. And so here's my script in case you want to do it. And I also linked to the release notes on GitHub for this version. And so Klaus had a interesting idea. He's like, well, can you automate this process so that a script posts this tweet for you? And he was correct that I did not have that in place. So I thought, oh, that's a good idea. Now, this isn't frequent, and it's not that difficult for me to tweet this once every month or whatever the release schedule is, but it isn't frequent, and it's just one more thing that I would have to do and remember to do and see the email, which I sometimes don't. So, okay, perfect test, a perfect situation to try and automate this process. So how might one do this? Well, I was wondering, my script that runs is kind of this second or third tier event system, right? So Freddy updates BcContainerHelper, it gets posted to GitHub, it gets compiled, it gets released in this repository or whatever the place where I'm downloading it from. Then I detect it, I download it, I install it, then I get a notification email. And so I was thinking, in theory, it might be better to get closer to the source of this event, the new release event. So I looked at GitHub, I was like, okay, so in theory, there might be something on GitHub that is an event that fires when a new release of a repository or application is published. There may be, but I don't know that, one, it is exposed very well, and two, I don't know, it didn't seem that I, as someone who's not involved with the BcContainerHelper repository, can get those events. It looks like those might be available to the owner of a repo. I don't think it's publicly available, as far as I could tell, based on the events I saw in Power Automate and Zapier. It didn't look like I could trigger based off an event of someone else's repo new release event. So anyway, didn't look like direct GitHub hook would work very well. So I said, okay, my backup is that I have my PowerShell that updates BcContainerHelper. I control that, and presumably that's fairly reliable and can do what I need. And then as I mentioned, I looked at Zapier because I have used that once before for a prototype, and it is super simple. Like it's I think it is a little more user-friendly for very basic tasks than Power Automate. However, that simplicity comes with some limitations. And so I looked at the GitHub hooks for Zapier, and there were like 3, and it's like, yeah, that's not going to work. So I quickly just abandoned that and said, no, I'm not even going to bother. I looked at Power Automate's GitHub hooks, and they had, I think, 4, but none of them were, it was like an issue or a pull request or something like that. It wasn't for a release event. So the GitHub hooks, I ruled out very quickly. I was like, okay, well, between the two, I know Power Automate a little better. I know it has more functionality, gives me a little more control, and I can have some more granular steps in my flow. So I'm going to go with that. And I already have an Office 365 or Power Apps account or whatever it is that gives me free Power Automate flows. So that's why I went with Power Automate. And I said, well, let me try to figure out if I can have my PowerShell call a Power Automate flow. Lots of power stuff in there. So let's give this a try. I built it, I think, yesterday, but I'm going to see if I can rebuild it from scratch to walk through the process and kind of show you what Power Automate can do. It's pretty crazy powerful. If you've ever developed web services, if you've ever developed automations, integrations, it's just like, wow, in a few minutes you can cobble this together and get it working. Very cool. And even if you don't think that you want to use a Power Automate flow in a production environment for some super critical process, I always say use it to prototype. You can prototype something in 30 minutes, work out all the kinks, figure out how this is going to work and what automation challenges or what authentication issues or what parameters you want in a given process. It's a great prototyping tool at a minimum, and it's very handy certainly for these like kind of ancillary tasks or non-critical tasks or things you just want to get rid of, get off your plate. So let's give it a try. Studio 4. So here I am in Power Automate, and let's assume that GitHub is not an option. I'll just briefly show you what options you have there. So I'm just going to create a new flow. Now, I'm kind of old school, and I don't like to use the templates. Like the templates, in my experience, just never exactly fit what I want to do. And it's often I just got to tear out everything and change it anyway. So I just create a new blank one. So we have automated cloud flows that some event's going to trigger it. We have an instant flow where I can click a button and fire it off. You can schedule it. Desktop is desktop automation, like desktop applications, or a business process flow. So I'm just going to do an automated cloud flow because some event, being my PowerShell script, is going to trigger this. Okay, so give it a name. Now, if you do this, you kind of have to choose some initial trigger. I don't even want to bother. Let's just skip all this stuff. I just want clean sheet of paper. So what trigger could I want? Well, let's say that I want to investigate GitHub. I just type GitHub, and there are hundreds and hundreds. I think it's 300 or 400 now of different connectors, events, triggers, you name it. So I'm going to choose GitHub. And as soon as I saw this, I said, yeah, this really isn't going to work. When a new issue is open, issue is assigned, and pull request. And it's like, nope. So they don't have a new release event. And even if they did, from what I could tell, it might not be available to me if I am not the owner of the repo. So those two things, I was like, okay, so let's just back up and forget about it. So I happen to be aware of an alternate method. So if my PowerShell script is running on my server, how might I trigger my flow? And they have this very cool trigger called a request. And this is an HTTP request. When you use this, Power Automate gives you a public URL that is a web service endpoint. It's like a REST web service. Super awesome. You don't have to set up a web server. You don't have to do anything. It's like, oh, here's your URL. Knock yourself out. Do you want to get? Do you want to post? Do you want to payload? You name it. So I'll show you that. So I'm going to trigger based on an HTTP request. So I figured that PowerShell can call my Power Automate flow endpoint to trigger it. So that was my theory, at least, right? So request body schema. Okay, so do I want to have any payload? And I thought, well, I could just call a URL and have it run and send out a very fixed tweet. But I want to be able to say what version of BcContainerHelper was released. So you see in my email here, I say that version 2.03 2.0.13 has been released. And my email has current version, latest version, and that I updated. So I'd like to mimic that. So I want the ability to send in the old version and the new version at a minimum. I also thought, well, a link to the release notes would be kind of nice. So why don't I have 3 parameters, old version, new version, and release notes URL? Okay, cool. So then I said, well, I might also let me put in the app name just to kind of generify it to be able to use this type of thing for multiple purposes. Maybe I want to update, send out a tweet when my PowerShell script updates my Business Central Docker containers to a new version. Maybe I want to say, hey, there's a new BC Docker image available. Old version is 18.2 blah, blah, blah. New version is 18.2345, something like that. So, okay, so I can make it a little more generic. So here I have sample JSON payload, BcContainerHelper, old version, new version, and a URL. So what is a JSON schema? I don't know. I don't really want to know. That's perfect. So what I can do is I'm just going to copy this. I didn't think I kept my JSON. So I'm just going to come up with some sample JSON. So let's say this is 0001 and my new version is 0002 and that is my app URL for the release notes. Great. All I have to do is take my sample JSON payload that I cobbled together, click on this link, use sample payload to generate schema, and Power Automate figures it out. It's like, oh, cool. I see what you want to send me. I'm going to create this JSON schema in order to parse the payload that you send in, and I will read those parameters for later on in the flow. Okay, hopefully this is making sense. URL will be generated after save, so it'll tell me that later. Okay, so now that I have a trigger that's going to activate my flow, what do I want to do? Well, if I want to just make it super simple, I could go directly to a tweet. So I could say Twitter, choose Twitter here, and I can post a tweet. Super cool. So what is the text I want to be posted? So Steve created this tweet on a live stream. Okay, so you'll see that it says insert parameters from previous steps. Look at that. And it automatically gives me all the parameters that were in my JSON payload. It's smart enough to do that. Very cool. And so I'll say, this is a tweet about, and I will click on app. So that'll give me my app name. Old version, and I'll click on old version. New version, click on new version. And you just go down and you just type whatever you want. You insert your text. Isn't that cool? Okay. So it could be this simple. Okay, you can even have media or an image, I guess, that posts. So I can click save and I could be done. In theory, I could be done. And so I'll say, send a tweet. Okay, so let me save that. So now that I have that, I can click on this and look at this URL. So behind the scenes, Power Automate Flow is using Azure Logic Apps. It's building a Logic app automatically, and as part of that, it's giving me this URL. So I can copy this URL. I can paste it in here, and I can actually use PowerShell to invoke web request and call this. So let's give this a try. So just to be clear, I've set up a PowerShell variable for the URI or the URL of my Power Automate request trigger. I'm going to pass in this JSON payload, and I'm going to make it a post. Because if you go over here, you'll see that this needs to be a post URL. There are some options, but yeah, I don't think any of those apply to us. Yeah, it has to be a post URL. Sometimes you can do a get URL if you're not submitting a JSON payload. So let's just give this a try. I have saved my tweet, or excuse me, I have saved my Power Automate Flow. So I'm going to click play and see what happens. Okay. So I just got a 202 accepted. So let me go to Twitter. And did it work? There we go. So Steve created this tweet on a live stream. Okay. Now, interestingly, my old version and new version did not make it in. Oh, because they're blank. Oops. Uh-oh. Come on. Little mousy on me. So I didn't define my old version and new version variables, so that makes sense. So that's why those are blank, but it worked. So pretty cool. There's our prototype, kind of have a proof of concept. And let me get all my windows back now that everything minimized on me. One moment. Okay. Okay, so we know it works. Let me delete that tweet and delete. Okay, so very cool. So with one line of PowerShell, I'm able to submit a JSON payload to Power Automate where it will assemble this into a tweet for me and send the tweet. Cool. So let's fancy this up a little. You could certainly run with this. Another neat thing about Power Automate is you have a 28-day run history. You just click on here, you see success or failure, and you can see here, oh, wow, look at this. Here are the parameters that got passed in. And then you can see the tweet that got posted and the tweet ID. So you see it's like debug information, all of the inputs, all the outputs, all the steps along the way. Super cool. So let's go back. Let's make this a little fancier. So you can do a bunch of things that make this a little nicer. So let's say that I want to validate the data that's coming in, that's being submitted. So I can create variables. I can search for a variable. I can initialize a variable, and let's call this app name to mimic, or I'll just call it app, to mimic the parameters that I'm passing in via JSON. So let's call it app, and I'm going to rename this and call this app variable. This is going to be a string, and the value that I want to store in this is app. Super simple, right? So now that my app variable is defined, I want to do a little security, pseudo security. So I'm going to do a validation. So I'm going to do a condition. So under the control, you see it's like a branching icon. I can do a condition. And I'll say if the app variable is equal to BcContainerHelper, okay, then I have a yes/no condition. And the UI can get kind of wonky here, but you kind of need full screen to make this happen. So if this is true, go to yes. If it is false, go to no, wherever that is. So if it is true, then everything is cool. I want to post a tweet. I'm actually going to drag this tweet step in here. That's all I need to do. If it is not, I'm going to have a response object. This is an HTTP response of, what is it? I can never remember. HTTP response codes. I think it's a 401, 400 authorized. 401 unauthorized. There we go. Okay, so let's do a 401 unauthorized. That's all I need to do. And here, if I want to be, very formal, I can do a response, choose request, have a response, and a 200. Okay. Now I can save this, and let's see what happens if I call this, and I don't submit BcContainerHelper. I'm going to submit BcContainerHelper 1. So let's hit play. Okay. Look at that. The remote server returned an error 401 unauthorized. So we've kind of put a minimal layer of security around this public endpoint. So that endpoint up there, anyone can hit it. As long as they have the full URL, it does include a key at the end. So it's not likely that someone's going to guess that. But just in case someone is able to hit that endpoint, you can just have a minimal layer of logic to trap, spam or malicious attempts to hit that endpoint. So that's something you can do. Now, I actually forgot what else I did in my real flow. So let's go back to my flow. Oh, let me just show you one thing. So here in the send to tweet, let's go back to the runs and see the run history. There we go. So it succeeded even though we got the 401. So let's see what that looks like. So we have our app variable, we have our condition, the input was BcContainerHelper 1, and the result is false. So we branch to the no condition, and we output a 401 error. So pretty cool. So that's how easy it is to cobble something together that takes a PowerShell script, has it call an endpoint, and posts a tweet. So let me see, let me look at the full flow and see what else I have in here. So I defined variables for all the parameters that are coming in. Now, as I just showed, it looks like that isn't necessary. I kind of thought it might be necessary, but apparently not. Looks like you can take those raw parameters out of the HTTP request and pass them in. But one thing these variables allow you to do is they allow you to type. So you can type them as strings, booleans, integers, whatever. So that gives you some further control later on in your flow to manage those variables. And let's see. I just did a condition at BcContainerHelper, and I retrieve the tweet ID, and I put an error condition in here. So if the tweet ID is, what was I doing here? Okay, so I think I was trying to say if the tweet succeeds, respond with a 200. If the tweet fails, respond with a 500 server error. And I think that should be 0, but trim, oh, is not equal to blank. Okay, so that's what I was thinking. So it's a string. I converted that to a string. As long as it's not blank, then that assumes I get a tweet ID in here. If I do not, return a system error, and then my PowerShell script can get that 500 response, say, this did not go well, and I can send that in an email notification saying, hey, Steve, the tweet didn't send. You might want to look into Twitter. Okay, so it's that simple. Now that I have the Power Automate flow, this is my prototype for the PowerShell script. So I just went into my update BcContainerHelper and scrolled down to the very end, and it's exactly the same code, right? So I call my Power Automate flow request trigger, the HTTP request trigger endpoint. I pass in BcContainerHelper, old new version, the link to the GitHub repo, release notes, and invoke reb request. Now, at the moment, I'm not handling a response from the Power Automate, if it's a 200, a 500, 401, whatever. I'm not currently handling that, but you certainly could. So that is the crash course in Power Automate of how I was able to, oh, I guess I didn't show, where's my PowerPoint here? I didn't show the actual tweet, so let me go find that. Where is it? Where is it? And it went out, I think, yesterday morning, and I didn't even know. I woke up and I saw this. I was like, oh, cool, it worked. So this was Power Automate. Oops, sorry, wrong screen. This was tweeted by Power Automate calling a flow, and it pushed this out. So it just so happens that yesterday, BcContainerHelper 2014 was released. So I show the old version, new version, and release notes. That simple. Very cool. Okay, so I hope that was interesting. And wait, where are we? Helpful? Man, too many screens. What is going on here? Okay. There we go, finally. So that was a very simple introduction to Power Automate flows and how you could incorporate them into a simple automated process. And it doesn't have to be terribly complex. You don't have to solve the world's problems in one flow. But I found that one of the most challenging aspects of creating a Power Automate flow is figuring out what you could use it for and getting creative about how you integrate it into some process. And it's very capable. It can do thousands of things, but oftentimes you don't think of it as a solution for a problem. Or if you do, it's like, well, how do I piece this together to get it to do all the things I want? And in this case, I had never used PowerShell to call a web service endpoint before. And so I just looked that up, and it was very simple. It's one line, as you saw. And I'd never created a flow to post a tweet before. I had seen in the past that there was some issues with it. It's like something about the Twitter API was not working right, or they were doing throttling or, anti-spam checks that were blocking Power Automate in the past. It was a while ago, but it looks like it works, at least for now, for my simple use case. So yeah, very cool. So with that, have a good Friday, and go try and create something. Okay, have a good one.
do do do.